we have 30 minutes over here for you to make decisions. You don't have that time. And you're going to come back and tell me, hey, in a real crisis, I'll have 3 days. I can equally come back and tell you, in a real crisis, you would have 300 times the amount of information I'm throwing at you, because it's always an abstract representation of the real world. So you have to be very careful what's valid and what's not. And the only way to do that is to talk to people who's doing that in real life.
You are listening to the Connected Podcast, coming to you from the heart of Taipei, in which we get personal on news and issues that connect us all in Taiwan and around the world. I am Tomasz Koper, and today we are talking war games. Now, you might have heard the term, probably in the news, and even more likely related to something really scary like war and conflict. So that's why today I have in the studio with me Kitsch Liao, and we're going to explain what war games are, why they matter, and how they're run. So Kitsch is the Associate Director of the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council and has worked on multiple war games.
Thank you, Thomas. It's great to be here and great to have this opportunity finally in Taipei, have enough time to be on the podcast.
All right, so let's talk war games. Most of our viewers and listeners have probably heard the term somewhere, be it either in the 1983 Matthew Broderick film called War Games, or if they're more like me, they might have heard the term associated with tables covered in felt and with a bunch of figurines of soldiers and different armies where nerds like me roll the dice and move units around and see kind of what happens and who wins. But War Games is actually, or the way people use the term is actually pretty confusing because they're cramming a lot of things together. The tabletop experience, red teaming, simulations, analyses. So can you give us a little clarity on what is behind the term, all the different elements there?
Yeah, so a little bit introduction on, how I got into this field in the first place, basically through our program, the Global China Hub. We have a lot of opportunity to contribute to discussions and wargamings as a tool to multiple, analysis, both inside the U.S. government and with Chinese government, and sometimes it's public and supported by, all sorts of foundations. So I've had the privilege to basically be taking part in multiple war games, sometimes playing the red team, sometimes, designing the game itself. And
that's the enemy team, right? Red team.
Yeah.
For those of our listeners who don't play video games.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's a great point to actually get started, right? So war game is sort of a colloquial term for a bunch of different things that's somewhat related, but a lot of them have this red teaming component, right? Basically, it's I'm gonna try to think what the enemy thinks, what the adversary thinks, and through research, or through brainstorming, I could basically try to challenge the blue team in this case, which is the intended audience for training or for exploration of possible alternatives, things like that. But in terms of wargaming, right? There's a lot. Are we talking about TTX, tabletop exercises? And occasionally modeling and simulation also got mixed on this. And also at different levels of wargaming, are we talking about polymill, the intersection between political decision and military decision making? Are we talking about strategic ones or operational tactical games where I actually put assets on the board? Or most of the time there's actually no board? Or am I just using different Excel sheets to see where I put all my assets, what munitions are, and then you run different things? But I think the important thing people have to understand, and people mostly misunderstood, is that the results of the war game usually do not matter. And blue team almost always loses. And there's a reason for that.
Okay.
Right? The results never matter because generally speaking, if you're doing war game, I'm speaking very broadly, and this might involve basically talking about all sorts of simulations, all sorts of TTXs that have people involved. Generally speaking, when you have that, your intent was never to basically have a credible results because it's not scientific, right? Think about it, right? Even if I have the same group of people playing the game 10 times, it's not representative anymore because you learn the rules of the game, you know how to game the game. This is not a representative sample anymore. And if I got different people involved, Again, like that's not representative anymore. So this is just for wargaming, but more broadly speaking, in terms of like military science, that's also a problem. We just don't have enough samples. So results don't matter. It depends on what you want to do. And also most of the time, blue team loses because you learn more and you can see more when they lose.
Okay, so you say results don't matter. So why do we have board games? Are they a training tool? Are they a communication tool for policymakers to kind of show them what the possible risks and dangers are? Why bother with all these different types of board games then?
Right. So everything you said is actually true. Like it can be for training, it can be for exploration, excuse me. But also like, military exercises are sometimes also called war games, right? And those are very different, like field exercises, command post exercises. Those are intended to basically exercise the component and the actions that has been pre-rehearsed that's in your manual. You want to see if that works, right? So that's very different. But a lot of TTXs, especially like the ones trying to explore an unknown situation, they play a few different roles. For example, you're trying to put decision makers in that mindset, right? Because generally speaking, I can talk all I want, I can read all I want, we can write analytical articles and read historical examples. You generally do not have that situation where, you have to make this a decision under all these constraint and time constraint. The closest you can get to is basically role-playing in war games. So that could be one of the reasons you want to do this. And the other one is trying to see how different components, how different people communicate. What are the problems that you never consider because there's no constraint, right? So a lot. And also training could be one of them. And we're all talking about just like, TTX with people involved.
Right.
There are other potentials, like, for example, if I'm trying to decide what weapons, what equipment am I going to buy, what sort of tactics, what sort of operational arrangement, operational deployment I want to do. Or, like, for example, if I want to supply different bases, like what's the most optimum arrangement? Then I might do some modeling and simulation. And sometimes people would call that war game too.
Right.
Those are, generally speaking, like I have more data, could be more scientific. I could run the same simulation for each variable confined and run for like 15, 30 times. And then I iterate on them, I change variables. And then I got 1,000 different runs. I could have statistical significant results talking about what are the most likely outcomes and compare different alternatives. That, broadly speaking, a lot of people would also call war games, but that's actually more modeling and simulation. And even more confusing, right? Sometimes people want to use modeling and simulation results as adjudication tools for war games where you have people.
Right.
So
let's stay with the kind of the more familiar context of the tabletop exercise, which just because people play board games, they might be more familiar with. Like how does a tabletop exercise compare to playing your Settlers of Catan, for example? Are there dice? Is there an adjudicator, like a game master, sort of like in tabletop role-playing games?
There's a lot of similarities, but what you're trying to achieve is very different. Because for, like your ordinary board games, you're trying to have fun. Right? Having fun as the results is what you're aiming for. So you're adjusting all different things. You're making up different rules. But the point is not to bore the players and not to, to challenge them just enough to get them on hook. Now, that component does exist in designing a scenario. And that's the other thing I want to talk about, designing a scenario. Most people, like when they look at war games, the first thing they're going to say is like, this is not realistic. Things should never happen this way. It would never happen this way. But most of the time, 98% of the time, that's beside the point. Mm-hmm. Because the entire point of a scenario is it good enough? Good enough for what? Good enough for your players, for your participants to have that suspension of disbelief. They can get in there and start thinking in a way that they would act if this situation were to happen for real. That's all it is. It just have to be representative. It just have to be sufficiently detailed for people to get devoted to the scenario and they can actually think what they're going to do. So that's the primary difference. And dice's adjudication, you have a lot of these different ones. And, this all serve the purpose of convincing the player that what you want them to do. I'll give you an example, right? Sometimes, occasionally, and I shall not name what game this is, you will have a bunch of several different scenarios prepared, and we told them like there's a very sophisticated adjudication rules and machines and simulation running in the background. And then, like after each round, we went away and come back and tell them like, okay, so this is your losses. You lost so many such and such. This is the results, what happened. But for that one particular one, we didn't do any calculation. We just made that up. But it's important for the players to believe that we did the calculation, right?
Right.
And also because the point of that particular exercise was not so was not so that I can know whether Blue Force is going to win or not. It's more like I want to know how you respond if you lose. I want to know like how much challenge and pressure can you afford to basically to shoulder under this sort of situation. Is your interagency, how do you coordinate with everybody? How do you handle crisis? So, the results, we could literally make that up. And that's why and that happens in a lot of other games too. So that's why going back to the original point, if this is the case, then the result literally doesn't matter because they cannot win. I just ordain that they're going to lose.
Okay, so on that note, who gets invited to those war games? See, even I am getting confused. Is it policymakers? Is it military decision makers? Is it analysts? Who do you want to test sort of in those conditions?
Again, it depends. It depends on what you're trying to achieve, right? So that's another major difference between your ordinary board game and your quote unquote war games or TTXs, right? A lot of these, basically you try to exercise what's going to happen on the day or what's going to happen if a real situation happens. And you don't have time to train everybody on what their job was supposed to be. You want to find the person who's already doing that job. They know what they're supposed to approach the problem. And the other thing to keep in mind is if you have a chance to design war games or TTXs for professional, professional military, government, or units, just remember your participants always knows more than you do. They have all the details required, right? You're not going to be able to out detail them. And, and the thing is if you go too much detail, they're going to get one thing wrong and they're going to say aha, this game is useless. It's all fake. I'm not going to be involved. So the level of detail is just enough, again, just as I said before, to get them involved, to get them devoted to this game. So they have that suspension of disbelief. But the people who came, generally speaking, you want people who's already doing their jobs. So that the dynamics between different people, again, this could vary very wildly depending on what you're trying to achieve. If I'm doing a war game at schools, I'm trying to educate everybody on respective roles, right? So it doesn't matter. I'm going to design my roles. I'm going to have an educational seminar. I'm going to brief everybody on what they're supposed to do. If I'm doing this within the government, a private war game, a private TTX, and the result is for everybody to learn something from it, I'm going to try to get the people who's already doing the job.
Do you ever put people who are doing those jobs and whose responsibility, let's say in wartime, would be, transportation? Do you put them in charge of transportation during that tabletop exercise? Or do you want them to do a different role during that exercise so that they also understand the challenges connected, industries and tasks, not just their own, which they might already kind of be more familiar with? You can't out-detail them, right? As you said.
It could be both, right? If I want to basically try to find out, as I said, not about the results, but try to find out if everybody's doing their job, what sort of friction, what sort of unexpected communication problems and coordination might arise, I may want everybody to just do their job and tell everybody this is a simplified version of the crisis of the management that you're going to handle. But we're intentionally avoiding a lot of details and see the big picture and see if there's major things that could gunk you up that you need to talk about this. Or if the intention for the war game, this might be two different war games, right? If the intention for the game that I'm holding for the second one is educational, role-playing, then of course, everybody play different roles and tell me what you see that that should or should not interfere with what you do before, right? So this sort of things does happen. It's almost two different things. And the other important thing, like as I talked about before, it's all about the players, especially if we're talking about this sort of, this is more than art than science, right?
Mm-hmm.
With people involved, TTX, you can only do limited iterations. Having people involved, having people properly prepared before they even show up for the war game is very important. And it's not just knowledge, it's also like what they understand about the game. One of the things we do repeatedly before each game is telling people like, we won't get all the details correct, but it is important for you not to fight the scenario and understand everybody here is doing the same thing. There might be inaccuracies. There might be things that go against what you understood. Keep this in the back of your head. Play the scenario. At the end, during the hot wash, during the review, we can all talk about this and we can discuss how much that affected what we're trying to achieve here.
What is the most surprising or interesting thing that you've learned through like a tabletop exercise?
Wow, there's a lot.
I guess that's good. That's the point of the exercise. Right?
It is. And this is a very popular method, especially for the past like 5-10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting part is like, even for your senior leadership, right? They just rarely have this sort of chance to actually exercise, to put everything they need to do into play, right? Like you never have that, right? Like we're not in Cold War anymore. You don't get to like exercise like what your nuclear buttons are or who launches what. And even if you do, it's very formulaic. Generally, the higher level of the participants you go, the less time you have with them. For example, if I'm just having an operational level game with a bunch of colonels, lieutenant colonels, and captains, I could demand like everybody come here for a week,
right?
Just camp out. If I have like 4-star, 3-star, I have assistant secretaries there, I have like people from NSC there, you'll be lucky if you have like, one morning or one afternoon of their time. And so like that also affects like what you can do. But generally speaking, I feel like most people appreciate that irrespective of what level they are, because it's so rare that you get to see everything you train for, everything you work for come together. So people do appreciate that. And that's very surprising to me in the sense like they're not paid to be here most of the time. It depends. Some services, some governments have budget for this, but most of the time you're asking people to take time out of their day to come without compensation. There are some, but generally not a lot. And people are still willing to show up.
What would you say is the effect of both war games in the tabletop exercise sense and simulations on policymaking? Is this just something that like smart people do and then kind of send to the government and then hope that something comes out of that? Or is it something that policymakers actually pay attention to?
So I would say all of the above. That's the problem, right? We're talking about a very wide range of different things. If I'm comparing two different weapon systems, or even if I'm going to buy a new weapon system, or I'm going to have a hodgepodge, like a combination of old weapon system to do the exact same job, then I run different simulations. And then, I have all the simulations there for people to see, for all the decision makers to make. Sometimes they would just ignore this. Sometimes they look and realize, like it may not be worth buying the new thing. That's the ideal anyway. This is modeling and simulation. But again, like that's impersonal, right? You're reading results of a table, of a table. Like you're not seeing things happening in front of you. You're not experiencing the stress of making decision. And that's the thing, right? People got influenced by the anchoring effect, right? The first thing they learned, the first thing they go through, they were like, oh, this is the right one. So there's that effect, playing a war game, playing a TTX, like being part of an in-person event. It could be very loose, seminar style with some TTX component, or it could be very rigid, like with fake news broadcast with like cutting of power to buildings to simulate like cyber attacks. You could have all the shenanigans you want, right? But all the point is basically to impart that impression on the participants. You want to extract like their reaction from them, and you also want them to learn something. But as a professional designer, you got to pull yourself back, right? Because the point is not to get to the gotcha moment. Because a lot of the times, if all you want to do is get to the gotcha moment, it's very easy. But again, like we talked about before, like how much do you do to get the participant to be involved, right? They have to believe this is real. They have to suspend their disbelief. If you throw too much at them too fast, they're just going to give up. They don't have a lot of stakes in this game. This is not real life. That you can only get them anchors so much. And also, it's definitely a balance between like, you want to test them on things they might not think of. You want to see like if there's familiar situations to lead them in, and unfamiliar situations to challenge them a little and see what you get, right? It's a fine, delicate balance. And that's why like this is never an exact science. The designer of the game has to be familiar with his audience, as in the participants. Also has to be familiar with the subject material. I talked before about the impossibility of having all the details needed, but you do need a significant understanding of the people you designed this for. This is almost a tailor-made thing. That's another major difference between a board game and a professional like TTX, a professional wargaming simulation. It's almost a tailor-made situation for the people or for the organizations you want to invite.
I know a lot of those scenarios, or most of those scenarios, in fact, are not like a board game in the sense that they're not equivalent and fair to begin with. I'm thinking here of simulating any kind of conflict or crisis in the Taiwan Strait, where obviously there's a huge imbalance in available forces and material and all of that. So on that note, do you think that the exercises that are conducted about Taiwan and in Taiwan, are they different than what we see kind of elsewhere in the world for whatever reason? Are there any specifics of like Taiwan-focused war games?
So if you're talking about war games with a Taiwan scenario component, especially in the military realm, like defense studies realm, that's almost every other game right now, right? In public or closed doors. But the difference here is just like what are these games trying to achieve? We have a lot of public games right now out here, like both in DC and in Taiwan. It is extremely unclear to me like what they're trying to achieve. There's a reason, right? For example, most of the TTX and war games are not open to the public. They're closed doors. Nobody knows what they happened. Very few people get to see them. Again, it's the same as closed door meetings for think tanks, right?
Right.
I need to openly talk about what went wrong and who did what. And if I'm opening this to the public, then it's about perception management. It's about playing a role. It's about what do I want the public to see. So if you have like professionals playing war games in a public setting, and the public doesn't understand what I was just talking about, right? They don't understand war games most of the time you're supposed to lose.
Right.
And also the results doesn't matter. And the results is also not valid. They don't know this, right? All they see is, hey, we lost again. Or, hey, that general failed to send what? Like, so that's the other issue here. So a lot of the times, like the intention behind all of this simulation of war game is good. It's getting the right message across on A, what war game is, and B, what the cross-strait situation, what Taiwan and China's situation actually is.
Even for war games that aren't open to the public, do you feel that there's a danger of like damaging morale, for example, right? If, let's say you only have colonels, you only have generals participate in a war game together, and then red team keeps winning. And even though they know that this is supposed to happen, this is the point of the exercise, do you feel that there might be some damage like, I guess we just can't win in this scenario?
So that's always a concern. That's what we got right now with China, right? People talk about China, people talk about the People's Liberation Army. It's always they're either 10 feet tall or they're nothing. There's nothing in between. There's no accurate assessment of what they would do.
Right.
And this happens from like, everything from open source to classified games. Point of clarification, I have no security clearance. I have no access to anything classified, but I do understand the dynamics between open games and classified games, right? So what you want in an open game, at least. It's not that, oh, red team come up with weird ideas, so we're just going to lose. It depending on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to see, this is my way of fighting, this is my way of dealing with problems, and the red team in this case is trying their best to come up with what could, the adversary and the enemy could conceivably do with some variations, right? You want to adjust to the point where they could learn, they understand what's going on. As I had talked about earlier, right? You have to restrain that gotcha moment, right? If I play a game, round 1, round 2, round 3, I keep getting beat back. By the time you reach round 3, even if this is your job, even if you've been told to, okay, this is your training opportunity, you got to go to this, you're going to say it's fine. It's fine. The real war is not going to be like this. It's fine. They could write whatever they want. So it's still that perfect balance, still that delicate balance. And sometimes in order to get to that balance, you are balancing reality as well, right? Because even though this might be something that could happen in reality, doesn't mean people believe it or be able to actually understand and take that to heart and react the same way.
Let's talk about simulations. You said that you can run the same kind of general scenario with different variables kind of tweaked slightly differently each time. Now, this sounds a lot like machine learning. So what has been the role of technology, especially over the last few years with LLMs and just AI getting better? Are you using similar technology in what you do in simulations?
So I'm doing less simulation. I have a cursory understanding of this. I help with a few projects, but I can broadly talk about this, right? Simulation is not what people generally think it is. There are several levels, from the most granular mission level simulations. This is probably what people are thinking about, because if there's a graphic component, you can see, oh, the jet is flying this way, the ship is sailing that way, the missile's shooting this way, and their range and countermeasures, electronic warfare, what my EMSO, and it takes a lot of time to put everything in place, and it has its place, right? But also, on top of this, you also have operational level simulations that doesn't even have a graphic component, because I might just be simulating about force deployment. At what point can I put my forces here? Can I do supplies here? And then you have strategic level games, right? So there's a concerted effort to try to link all three to see if I can feed my mission level modeling into my operational modeling. Can I simulate if I have a war, what happens? And we're just not there yet. The thing is everything goes way too fast because you're missing way too much variables, because people are complex, right? There's mistakes, there's unexpected things. And so basically you're talking about whether we use AI to run this. The answer is probably no, because what I know, for example, if you're doing a comparison study, right? Am I going to buy this helicopter here, or am I going to buy this missile here in order to achieve the same tank killing mission? Then I set up different variables, how the battlefield is deployed, what kind of weather conditions, terrains, everything. The money costing part, and the part that costs the most resources, because you need people to go and read every one of the iterations to see if it's valid, right? If I run 1,000 times, I might get to the point where oh, this helicopter just happened to pop up over here and kill that tank. And the tank just didn't see him, because I'm gaming the game because the model of the tank in the game can't see the helicopter. But a person read this and says well, I mean, they have infantry deployed around them. And also they can see the helicopter, they can hear the helicopter. It might be a model problem. So that's where all the money went. That's where all the expensive part is. And that's something AI can help to a degree. But again, you need 100% validity. So, and because you want that statistical confidence level to know what the most common situations are. For example, in comparing two different options.
So when you run a scenario without human input versus when you actually put a real human or a group of humans in the loop, what are some of the sort of immediate changes? Basically what I'm asking, what have you learned about human nature through designing, running, and analyzing war games?
So again, it depends on what you're trying to achieve, right? The reason all the acquisition models are using simulation and modeling to basically to compare is because I can take human out of the loop. I can just compare the systems, right? If the humans are equally good enough, what piece of code equipment could probably do better?
Mm-hmm.
And you want human in the loop because you want to see how humans actually respond to all of this, right? So that's a valuable observation. But again, at that point, you don't have that statistical certainty on, how the results would turn out. And by the way, this is not just a simulation or wargaming problem. This is a general problem for military studies. Because, for example, in terms of social studies, even for case studies, generally speaking, you have a lot more data point than military conflict. Military conflict and war, basically, as a number of events that happen in human history, is so rare and so infrequent, it's really hard to draw valid lessons or even scientifically, statistically significant results from comparing a lot of this. That's why it's still an art. That's why we call operational art and not operational science, right? And so in a war game, you have people involved. Generally, you're not comparing two groups of people, or you're not even comparing the same group of people across different games, because they learned, they understood, and then they know they're going to make different decisions next time. And so you have observations, you have inspirations. You don't have valid results, right? I could say I observe under certain situations when they're stressed, the interagency coordination might be problematic. It might be sporadic. Their first instinct is to develop their own plan without coordinating with everybody else. Or conversely, they want to coordinate with everybody, and this creates a lot of wasted time. You might not have that time, and you want to individually respond to everybody. You want all the messages piled here. We have 30 minutes over here for you to make decisions. You don't have that time. And you're going to come back and tell me, hey, in a real crisis, I'll have 3 days. I can equally come back and tell you, in a real crisis, you would have 300 times the amount of information I'm throwing at you. So this sort of back and forth comparison between real world and what the game is trying to abstractly represents, because it's always an abstract representation of the real world. So you have to be very careful what's valid and what's not. And the only way to do that is to talk to people who's doing that in real life. I have to be very strongly emphasize that this is not a science. This is still very much an art. It's like practicing a craft, right? It's not scientific, but at some point, there's certain validity to it because it does help with the process.
Do you feel that especially today, you mentioned that things change, especially with kind of the simulations.
Yeah.
Things change very, very quickly. With this kind of rapid advancement of military tech and doctrines, now focused on drones, do you still feel that there is value in having people participate in something like that, especially decision makers? I mean, because I can see a scenario where that might actually put people in a certain way of thinking, right? This is the scenario that this is something that I've gained, right? This is something that I've gone through. This is something that I've practiced. But if a completely different element or a game changer comes in, they might not be flexible enough to get out of that rut, to get out of that way of thinking and switch to a new channel that the situation demands.
That's exactly right? So it's very important. It's the same as we talked about earlier on public messaging and private messaging as well. To get the right message out of your war game, you really need to understand what is valid, what is a valid observation that's not 100% of the time work, but probably, that's something you want to look at, and what's completely irrelevant, and it's just an artifact of your scenario design. There's other famous examples where, before the Second World War, the U.S. Navy fleet games, right? There's an exact scenario that looks, smells, and feels exactly like Pearl Harbor. And people are like, well, you knew this was going to happen. Why didn't you prepare for this? But that's not the point, right? Because again, at that point, they were testing for different things. They have this scenario that was not a valid scenario under what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But to another point, basically about what's valid and what they're trying to challenge, two different things, right? First, you're trying to, most of the time, when you're holding this sort of TTX or having people around the table, you're actually trying to break them out of a rut. So you're trying to challenge them. Yes, you're accustomed to this way of doing things, this way of discussing and decision-making process. I'm trying to see if there's a flaw in this, there's something that you missed. You want to get them out of that rut, but you are entirely correct. You might very well push them into another rut. And they were just like, oh, this is a different way of doing things. But I guess this is the new way of doing things now. I'm going to start doing everything this way. So again, it's very important to prepare your audience. And it's very important to discuss with them right after the game. And it's very important to let them understand what's valid and what's not, and what the takeaway should be. And this is a game designer, adjudicator's perspective, right? That's where their professional expertise comes into being, because they know what results are probably because the way I designed the game this way, and what results are unexpected, and it's, arises from interaction between different groups of people naturally under this kind of situation, under a valid assumption. You're still fresh to this game. You don't know all the rules. You're playing as if you're playing a real game. That's great. The second time you play this, the results might not be as valid. And by results, I mean, the decisions you make, the dynamics you have might not be as good, because what the game's limitation might be. So all of this has to be taken into consideration, and that's why it's still an art.
Thank you very much. Kitsch Liao, the Associate Director at the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Thomas.
And what would your winning strategy be in a war game involving your country? Let us know in the comments below. And do also check out our main show, Connected on Taiwan Plus, which you can find on our YouTube channel and the Taiwan Plus website. Until next time, I'm Tomasz Koper.